Before you continue, ask yourself this. What kind of man makes a room go silent without raising his voice? The answer, on that evening, was Luca Moretti. In the polished glow of his penthouse dining room, where the city lights shimmered through floor-to-ceiling windows and the table gleamed with crystal, Luca sat at the head of the long mahogany table with the stillness of someone used to being obeyed. He was a man who noticed everything and revealed almost nothing, his dark suit cut perfectly, his expression unreadable as guests laughed softly around him, careful not to say anything foolish in his presence. Across the room, Maribel stood near the service entrance with a silver tray in her hands, dressed in a simple black uniform that made her look even smaller beside all that wealth. She had spent the entire evening moving quietly between the kitchen and the dining room, keeping her eyes lowered, speaking only when spoken to, the way she had learned to survive in places where people assumed silence meant invisibility. But Luca had noticed her the moment she entered, not because she was trying to be seen, but because she was not. There was a calmness in the way she worked, a steadiness that felt almost out of place in a room full of polished smiles and practiced manners. He had asked for this dinner to discuss business with relatives he trusted less than he trusted the walls, and he had expected tension, perhaps even flattery, but not the one small detail that would shift the entire evening. It happened when his young son, Nico, slipped away from the end of the table and wandered toward the hallway with sleepy eyes and a faint crease of worry between his brows. No one noticed at first. The conversation kept flowing, glasses were lifted, compliments were exchanged, and Maribel, passing by with an empty tray, was the first to see the child pause by the doorway as if he had suddenly forgotten where he belonged. She stopped without thinking, set the tray aside, and lowered herself just enough to meet his eyes. "Are you looking for your father?" she asked softly. Nico hesitated, then gave a small nod, but before he could answer, his lip trembled and he looked down at his hands as if the world had become too large for him to explain. Maribel did not rush him. She simply waited, patient and warm, as though time itself had softened around that moment. Luca, watching from across the room, felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. It was not surprise, exactly. It was recognition. The child reached for Maribel's sleeve, and she gently held his hand, guiding him back from the hallway without a word of panic or command. She knelt beside him, pointed toward the table, and said something so quietly that only he could hear. Nico's shoulders eased at once. Then, in a voice so small it nearly disappeared into the hum of the room, he said, "Papa." The word landed like a bell in Luca's chest. For a second, he did not move. His face remained calm, but inside him, something old and buried had stirred awake. He had not heard that word spoken with such trust in a very long time. Maribel looked up only once, and when her eyes met his, she did not flinch. She simply held the child's hand a little longer, as if she understood that some moments are too delicate to rush. And Luca, for reasons he could not yet explain, found himself standing up from the table before anyone had time to ask why. The room did not recover from that single word. Forks hovered over plates, conversations died in the air, and even the staff near the sideboard seemed to forget how to breathe. Luca remained standing beside the table, his expression unreadable, but his attention had narrowed to the small child in the hallway and the woman beside him who had somehow steadied him with nothing more than a hand on his sleeve and a quiet voice. Maribel rose slowly from her kneeling position, her face calm, her posture careful, as if she understood that sudden movements would only make the moment feel more fragile. Nico stayed close to her, one small hand still resting against her skirt, his eyes fixed on Luca with the solemn trust of a child who had already decided something important. Luca looked at the boy, then at Maribel, and for the first time that evening, something in his controlled manner shifted. It was not softness exactly, but it was close enough to feel dangerous to the people in the room who had never seen him hesitate before. He motioned once, and the entire table fell silent because no one dared ignore him. "Bring him here," he said, his voice low and even. Maribel did not move at once. She glanced down at Nico, searching his face for fear, but he only looked back at her and gave a tiny nod, as if he trusted her to know what to do. So she guided him forward step by careful step, the polished floor reflecting the lights above them like water. When they reached the edge of the dining room, Luca studied them both in that still, measuring way of his, and what he saw was not manipulation or calculation. It was something far more disarming. It was patience. The woman did not thrust the child toward him, and she did not demand gratitude for herself. She simply waited, hands folded loosely before her, while Nico stood between them like a bridge neither of them had expected. Luca looked down at the boy. "What did you call me?" he asked, though he already knew. Nico lifted his chin, uncertain now that the room had become so quiet, but Maribel crouched beside him again and brushed a curl from his forehead. "It is all right," she murmured. "You can say what you feel." The child swallowed, then turned his face upward with a courage so small it made Luca feel it in his chest. "Papa," Nico whispered again. The word did not belong there, and yet it fit with cruel tenderness. Luca's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. No one at that table had ever heard a child speak to him that way. No one had ever used that word with such unguarded need. He glanced at Maribel, expecting confusion or apology, but found neither. Instead, he found a look that held quiet understanding, as if she had already seen the shape of the wound that word touched. In that instant, Luca remembered the silence of his own childhood home, the long years after loss when every room had felt too large and every chair at the table had felt too empty. He had built a life out of distance, discipline, and control because those things were safer than wanting anything he could lose. But the child before him was not asking for safety. He was asking for belonging. Luca pulled out the chair nearest him and sat, not because he had to, but because standing suddenly felt too far away. He kept his gaze on Nico, though his voice softened almost against his will. "Come here," he said. The boy looked up at Maribel first. She gave him the smallest encouraging smile, and Nico took one uncertain step, then another, until he was close enough for Luca to see the faint smudge of color on his cheek and the seriousness in his eyes. Luca extended one hand, slow and deliberate, giving the child every chance to retreat. Nico stared at it for a second, then placed his small hand in Luca's. The contact was brief, but it struck with the force of something long delayed. Luca's fingers closed carefully, not squeezing, not claiming, only holding as if he had just been handed something breakable and precious. Maribel watched without speaking, and in her stillness there was no greed, no triumph. Only the restrained emotion of someone witnessing a moment she had not dared hope for. Across the room, a crystal glass gave a faint, accidental chime as someone set it down too quickly, and that tiny sound seemed to remind everyone else that they had been watching a life change in real time. Luca did not look away from the child. His voice, when it came, was quieter than before. "Are you hungry?" Nico did not answer right away. He glanced at Maribel again, and she nodded once. "A little," he admitted. Luca's mouth moved in the faintest shadow of something that might have been a smile. "Then you will eat," he said simply, and the certainty in those 3 words settled over the room like a promise. For a moment, the room seemed to understand that nothing ordinary would happen next. Luca remained by the table, one hand resting loosely against the back of his chair, but his gaze kept returning to Nico, who now stood a few feet away with Maribel beside him, both of them caught in the strange calm that follows an emotional shock. The little boy was no longer trembling. He was simply watching Luca with the careful seriousness children reserve for adults they are not yet certain they can trust. Maribel noticed it too, and her heart tightened with a feeling she did not dare name too quickly. She had seen rich men give orders. She had seen powerful men perform generosity when others were watching, but she had also learned how quickly kindness could disappear when it was tested by inconvenience. Luca, however, did not move like a man trying to impress anyone. He moved like someone who had just discovered a truth about himself and was still deciding what to do with it. "Come here," he said softly, not to command but to invite. Nico hesitated only once before stepping forward. The child stopped just short of Luca, looking up at him with wide eyes. Luca lowered himself slightly, matching the boy's height, and the gesture changed the air in the room more than any loud announcement could have. "What do you like to eat?" he asked. Nico glanced back toward Maribel, and she gave him the smallest encouraging nod. "Mac and cheese," he said at last, almost shyly, "and apples if they are sweet." Luca's eyes shifted to the nearest server, who had been frozen in place since the first moment this had begun. "Bring him both," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, and bring something warm for Maribel as well." The words were simple, but they made her look up in surprise. She opened her mouth to protest, to say she was fine, to remind him that she was only there to help the child settle, but Luca had already turned his attention back to Nico. "You do not need to be afraid here," he told him. "Not tonight." The boy studied him for another long second, then nodded as if storing the sentence somewhere safe. Around them, the guests pretended not to listen, but the silence had grown so complete that even the faint movement of silverware across plates sounded too loud. Maribel could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, not hostile now, but searching, as if everyone had begun to understand that something in Luca had shifted in front of them and would not shift back. She knew better than to mistake a single kind gesture for a full change of heart. Still, she also knew that children noticed what adults tried to hide, and Nico's shoulders had already started to loosen. When the food arrived, Luca did not wait for anyone else to begin. He watched the boy take his first bite, then another, and the hard line in his face faded by the smallest degree. Maribel, standing just behind Nico, saw it happen and felt an unexpected ache in her chest, because she recognized the look. It was the look of a man who had gone too long without permission to care. And just as she thought the moment could not grow any quieter, Luca lifted his eyes to her and said, almost under his breath, "You stayed with him when you did not have to." Maribel held his gaze. "He needed someone," she replied. Luca nodded once, slowly, as though that answer mattered far more than he wanted to admit. Then, in a voice so controlled it barely seemed human, he said, "People who do that are not forgotten in my house." Maribel had just begun to believe that the evening might settle into something fragile and almost ordinary when Luca's phone vibrated against the table. The sound was so soft that most of the room would have missed it, but Maribel saw the change in him at once. His eyes shifted, his jaw tightened, and the quiet authority that lived in his posture seemed to gather itself into something harder, more focused. He did not answer immediately. He looked at Nico first, as if checking that the little boy was still comfortable, still calm, still safely wrapped in the small pocket of peace he had been given. Then Luca rose from his chair with measured patience and stepped away from the table, one hand lifting the phone only after he had created enough distance to keep the moment from touching the child. Maribel watched him move across the private dining room, his dark suit catching the warm light from the sconces, his expression unreadable from where she stood. There was no panic in him, no visible alarm, only the controlled stillness of a man who understood exactly how much trouble could fit inside a single call. Near the side wall, Luca listened without speaking for several seconds. The silence around him seemed to deepen, as though even the staff had sensed that something important was happening and had chosen not to interrupt it. Maribel remained beside Nico, but her attention drifted fully toward Luca now, because people like him did not need to raise their voices to change the temperature of a room. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm enough to be almost gentle, and yet it carried the kind of weight that made everyone nearby look down at their hands. "Say that again," he said. Then he listened once more. The second pause lasted longer than the first. By then, Nico had reached for the bread on his plate with the quiet confidence of a child who no longer feared the room, and Maribel took that as proof that whatever Luca had given him in those few minutes had already become real. Luca ended the call at last, but he did not return right away. Instead, he stood with the phone lowered at his side, staring into the middle distance as if he were weighing the shape of a decision that would not stay private for long. When he came back to the table, the change in him was subtle but unmistakable. His expression remained composed, yet there was something newly attentive in his eyes, something that seemed to have been sharpened by what he had just heard. He looked first at Nico, then at Maribel, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "We need to leave this place tonight," he said. The words were simple, but they landed heavily. Maribel's body went still. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Luca did not answer her immediately. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, not as a guest this time, but as a man about to make a promise he intended to keep. His gaze held hers with a steadiness that made it impossible to look away. "Nothing that you need to fear right now," he said. "But someone has been watching this family for longer than you realize." Maribel did not move at first. The words hung between them, quiet but heavy, and for one suspended second she could only look at Luca, as if she were trying to understand whether danger had just entered the room or whether it had been there all along. Nico sat very still beside her, his small hand resting on the edge of the table, his face unreadable in the soft light. Luca rose with measured calm and looked toward the doorway where two of his men had already appeared, silent as shadows, waiting for a signal he had not yet given. "Keep the boy close," he said, his voice low and even. Maribel's throat tightened. "Is it someone from outside?" she asked. Luca did not answer directly. His eyes moved once across the dining room, taking in the windows, the exits, the faces pretending not to listen. "Tonight, the only thing that matters is getting you both somewhere safe," he said. There was no drama in the way he spoke it, no wasted emotion, only certainty. That certainty unsettled her more than fear would have. She had spent too many years learning that men who sounded this calm usually had reasons. Nico looked up at him. "Are we in trouble?" he asked softly. Luca's gaze dropped to the child, and whatever hardness had gathered in his expression eased by a fraction. "No," he said. "Not you." Then he reached out and gently adjusted the back of Nico's chair, a small gesture that seemed strangely intimate in a room built on distance and control. Maribel watched him, caught between gratitude and unease, because there was something in the way he moved now that suggested the decision had already been made before he returned to the table. One of his men leaned in just enough to murmur something into his ear, and Luca gave a single nod. "The car is ready," the man said. Luca stood there for a moment, silent, as if listening to a rhythm no one else could hear. Then he turned back to Maribel. "Finish your water," he said quietly. "We are leaving now." She obeyed without thinking, lifting the glass with hands that had begun to tremble only after she realized how completely she trusted his tone and how dangerous that trust might become. The room around them remained strangely still, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of surprise. It was the silence that comes just before a door closes, before a choice cannot be taken back. Luca offered his hand to Nico first, and the child took it without hesitation. That simple trust seemed to land somewhere deep in him. For one brief moment, his face softened in a way that made him look less like a man built of command and more like one carrying an old wound he had never named. Then the softness vanished. He looked at Maribel again, and his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear it. "Do not let go of his hand," he said. "Not until I tell you it is safe." Maribel nodded, her pulse beating hard beneath her ribs, as Luca guided them toward the entrance and the waiting dark beyond the glass. And in that instant, with the entire room watching and saying nothing, she understood that the evening had crossed into something larger than a simple warning, something that would not end when they stepped outside. Maribel did not ask where they were going. She only tightened her grip around Nico's small hand as Luca guided them through the side entrance and into the colder air beyond the glass. The night outside was all polished stone, black cars, and men who moved with the silent precision of people trained never to waste a second. In the passenger seat of the first vehicle, Maribel sat with Nico pressed close to her side, the child quiet but alert, his eyes reflecting the passing streetlights. Luca took the seat across from them, one arm resting along the back of the leather bench, his expression hard to read in the dim interior. He looked forward through the windshield for several long seconds before speaking. "The calls were made from inside my circle," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a weight beneath it that made the words settle heavily in the car. Maribel looked down at Nico, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Is he safe?" she asked. Luca's gaze moved to the child first, then to her. "For tonight, yes," he said. "That is all I am willing to promise until I know more." The driver said nothing. The city slid past in blurred ribbons of light, storefronts, and empty intersections, and closed windows reflecting the dark. Nico leaned a little closer to Maribel, then whispered, "Are we in trouble?" The question landed in the car like something fragile enough to break. Before Maribel could answer, Luca spoke. "No," he said, and there was a steadiness in that single word that seemed meant for the child as much as for her. "You are with me now." Nico studied him for a moment, then gave the smallest nod, as if deciding that this answer was enough for the time being. Maribel noticed then what she had missed inside the restaurant, the faint tension at Luca's jaw, the way his hand stayed near his phone without touching it, the way he kept checking the rearview mirror when he thought no one was watching. This was not a man who had been surprised. This was a man who had already begun preparing for what came next. When the car finally turned toward a quiet part of the city, the buildings changed. The bright shops gave way to older homes with deep porches and dark windows, then to a private estate surrounded by iron fencing and trees that moved softly in the wind. The gates opened without delay. Inside, the house stood glowing under warm lights, elegant but guarded, beautiful in the way a fortress could be beautiful when someone had taken great care to hide the walls. Maribel followed Luca up the steps, one hand still on Nico's shoulder. The front doors opened before they reached them, and an older woman in a dark dress stepped aside with a respectful nod. "This is Elena," Luca said. "She runs this house." Elena's eyes moved to Maribel, then softened when they found Nico. "I will have something warm ready for the child," she said gently. Nico looked up at Maribel before letting go of her hand, and even that small release seemed to cost him effort. Luca noticed. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Then he looked toward the hallway as one of his men appeared at the edge of the foyer. "Report," he said. The man stepped forward and spoke in a low voice Maribel could not fully hear, but she caught enough to understand that something had already been found. Luca did not react with surprise. He only listened, still as stone, then gave a brief nod. When the man left, the silence in the house felt different than it had in the restaurant. It was quieter, yes, but also sharper, like the calm before weather changes. Maribel stood beside Nico and realized she was waiting for Luca to explain what he already knew. He looked at her then, his face unreadable again. "Someone thought they could reach this family through a child," he said. "They were wrong." Nico's fingers tightened around Maribel's sleeve. Luca's voice lowered. "Stay here tonight. Both of you." For a moment, she wanted to argue, to ask what danger had followed them to this place. But the look in his eyes told her that the answer would not bring comfort. Instead, he turned to Elena and said, "Make sure they are both looked after." Then, after a brief pause that seemed to cost him something, he added, "And keep the doors locked." Before the house had fully settled into its uneasy silence, Maribel found herself standing near the window with Nico tucked close beside her, the boy's small hand still wrapped around her fingers as if letting go might make the world change again. Outside, the grounds were washed in pale moonlight, the stone path gleaming softly beneath the security lights, and the line of dark vehicles waiting near the entrance looked less like cars and more like a warning. Inside, Elena moved through the foyer with careful, efficient steps, checking the doors, lowering the lights, and speaking only when necessary. No one in the room needed to say aloud that the evening had shifted into something far beyond a family misunderstanding. Maribel could feel it in the way the staff no longer crossed the space casually, in the way even the older men near the hall had gone quiet, listening for instructions that had not yet come. Nico looked up at her once, his expression serious in the way only children could manage, and asked in a small voice, "Are we safe here?" The question landed softly, but it changed the air around them. Maribel crouched so she could meet his eyes, smoothing the hair from his forehead with a hand that hoped steadiness could be borrowed. "Yes," she said, and though she spoke gently, she meant every word she could honestly offer. "For tonight, you are safe." The boy nodded, accepting that answer the way children do when they have learned that adults are carrying more than they say. From across the room, Luca was on the phone again, one shoulder angled toward the window, his voice quiet, and even enough to make the people nearby uneasy. He was not raising it. He never needed to. Every sentence seemed chosen with the care of a man who understood that calm could be more dangerous than shouting. When the call ended, he stood still for a moment, looking out into the dark as if the night itself might confess something if he watched long enough. Then he turned back toward them, and the room seemed to tighten around his silence. "The people watching this family did not choose the right child to use," he said, "and they did not choose the right night." No one answered him. Even Elena lowered her eyes, as though she had just heard a door lock somewhere deep inside the house. Maribel felt Nico lean closer to her side, and she realized the child was not frightened because Luca was present. He was frightened because Luca was the kind of man who could make danger feel very close without ever appearing hurried. Luca's gaze moved to the boy, then back to Maribel, and something subtle changed in his face, not softness exactly, but a decision that had already been made. You will stay in the West Wing tonight, he said. There is a safer room there, and the hallway will be watched. Maribel opened her mouth, then stopped. She wanted to ask how long this was meant to continue, what exactly he knew, and whether the quiet in the house meant the danger had passed or only paused. But Luca had already turned to Elena. Bring them water, he said, and something warm for the child. Then, after a brief pause that felt heavier than the rest of the conversation, he added, No one enters that wing unless I say so. The command did not sound like panic. It sounded like control. It sounded like a man drawing an invisible line and expecting the world to respect it. Maribel watched him cross the foyer, the sharp line of his suit disappearing toward the deeper rooms of the house. And for the first time that night, she understood that he was not merely reacting to a threat. He was preparing for something larger, something that had been circling them long before the first warning ever reached the table. Maribel stayed close to Nico as the safe room door closed behind them, the soft click sounding far louder than it should have in the quiet hall. The space was smaller than the rest of the house, but it had been prepared with care, warm lamps glowing against the walls and a folded blanket waiting over the back of a chair. Everything about it said that someone had thought ahead, and that thought alone made her chest tighten. Nico looked up at her, still holding on with one hand, his face tired in the gentle way children became tired after too much fear. Maribel brushed a strand of hair from his forehead and tried to keep her breathing steady. She had learned, long ago, that children did not need perfect answers. They needed calm. They needed a hand that did not shake when the world did. Down the hall, she heard low voices moving through the house, measured and restrained, the kind of voices that belonged to people who knew how to keep panic from spreading. Elena had brought water, then warm milk for Nico, and she had left both within reach before stepping back without a word. That quiet courtesy touched Maribel more than she expected. It was not pity, it was respect. And in a house like this, respect felt almost as rare as peace. Nico climbed onto the edge of the couch and leaned against her shoulder, his small body finally beginning to loosen. Are we still going home later? He asked. The question was simple, but it landed in her heart with painful weight. Maribel looked toward the closed door before answering. We are safe right now, she said softly. It was not the same as a promise, and she knew he could hear that. Still, he nodded as if choosing to trust her was easier than asking more. She reached for the cup Elena had left and warmed her hands around it while Nico sipped slowly. Through the narrow window, the moonlit grounds stretched in silver and shadow, and the line of vehicles near the entrance stood unmoving beneath the security lights. Maribel could not stop herself from wondering how many people were watching, how long the night would continue, and what Luca had seen that he had not yet said aloud. He had not raised his voice. He had not rushed. That was what unsettled her most. Everything about him still felt controlled, measured, deliberate, as if he had already accepted that whatever came next would require patience more than force. A few minutes later, the door opened and Luca stepped inside. He did not bring the cold with him, but he brought the weight of it. His suit was still immaculate, his expression still unreadable, yet there was a different strain in his face now, something quieter and more human than the polished authority he wore so well. His eyes went first to Nico, then to Maribel, and for a moment he said nothing at all. The silence was not empty. It was full of the kind of care people rarely admitted out loud. He is settling in, Maribel said before he could ask. Luca gave a brief nod and moved closer, stopping a respectful distance away. Good, he said. Then his gaze shifted toward the window, toward the dark outside. I have men checking every entrance. No one is coming in without being seen. He said it evenly, but Maribel heard the truth beneath the calm. This was not a passing concern. It was a boundary being enforced. She studied him for a moment, then asked the question she had been holding back since the table, since the warning, since the first change in the room. What happens now? Luca looked at her for a long second, and when he answered, his voice was low and certain. Now we wait long enough to learn who thought they could reach this house. The words settled over her like a shadow, but there was something else in them too, something steadier than fear. He was not asking her to brave this alone. He was placing himself between her and whatever had begun to close in. And when Nico, half asleep against her shoulder, murmured Luca's name with the sleepy trust of a child who felt protected, Maribel saw the expression flicker across his face. It was gone almost immediately, but not before she caught it. The hard line of him softened in a way that looked almost like grief, almost like memory, almost like a man who understood too well what it meant to protect someone and fail. He turned slightly, as if collecting himself, then said, "Stay here until I come back." Maribel did not ask where he was going. She only watched him leave the room with that same controlled calm, and this time she understood that his silence was not indifference. It was preparation. It was resolve. And somewhere beyond the walls of the house, the night was still waiting. The first sound Maribel heard was not a voice, but the soft hum of the safe room lamp and the uneven rhythm of Nico's breathing against her shoulder. The whole house seemed to hold itself in a different kind of silence now, the kind that arrived after fear had already been named. Luca stood near the door, one hand resting lightly on the frame, his posture composed in the way of a man who had learned how to remain still while everything around him shifted. He had left and returned with answers, and though he had said very little, the tension in his jaw made one thing clear. The danger had not passed, only changed shape. Maribel watched him in the warm light and tried to understand the strange calm he wore so well. It was not the calm of a man who believed the night would be easy. It was the calm of someone who had already accepted responsibility for whatever came next. Elena had brought water, a folded change of clothes, and a plate of untouched food that none of them seemed able to reach for. Nico had finally fallen half asleep, his small hand still caught in Maribel's fingers as if even dreams might pull him away. Every so often he stirred, and each time Luca's eyes moved to him with a quiet vigilance that was impossible to miss. There was something in that look that Maribel had not expected to see from him so soon, something almost tender and almost painful, as if caring for a child had opened a door in him that he had spent years keeping closed. When Nico mumbled again, too softly to make out, Luca crossed the room and crouched beside the chair without hesitation. He did not touch the child at first. He only watched him for a long moment, his face unreadable except for the faintest change around the eyes. Then he reached out, careful and slow, and adjusted the blanket where it had slipped from Nico's shoulder. The gesture was so gentle that Maribel felt her own throat tighten. No one said anything. The house, the night, the danger beyond the walls, all of it seemed to recede into the space between that single motion and the child's peaceful breathing. Luca rose again and looked at Maribel, his expression guarded but no longer distant. "He will stay here tonight," he said quietly, his voice low enough not to wake Nico. "And so will you." Maribel should have bristled at the certainty in his tone. Instead, she found herself staring at him, because beneath the control, beneath the discipline, there was a kind of steadiness that felt almost like safety. "What is happening out there?" she asked at last. For a moment, he did not answer. His eyes shifted toward the darkened window, where the reflection of the room floated faintly over the glass. When he spoke, his voice was even, but there was weight in every word. "Someone thinks this house can be pressured into silence," he said. "They are mistaken." Elena lowered her gaze and quietly left the room, closing the door with care. The clicks sounded final. Maribel looked from the door back to Luca, and in that brief stillness she saw something settle in him, a decision made long before he had spoken it aloud. He was no longer only shielding the house. He was choosing what kind of man he would be inside it. And because of that, the air itself seemed to change. He took one step back, giving her space, but his eyes remained steady. "You do not need to be afraid here," he said. It was not a promise made lightly. It was delivered like a fact he intended to prove. Maribel felt the truth of his words before she understood them. In the quiet room, with Nico sleeping between them and the night pressing gently against the glass, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The fear remained, but it no longer ruled the room. And for the first time since the warning at dinner, Maribel let herself believe that whatever came next, she would not face it alone.